Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin Weiss. I'm the Austrian ambassador to the United States. I'm really happy to see you all here. You know, the last 2 COVID years were complicated for all of you, certainly complicated for diplomats. Our job is often described as a contact sport, and how do you even do that in COVID times? Some things you can do, some things you cannot do. We had to stop our Botstiber lectures, and we are really happy to have this up and running tonight with an excellent speaker. Really looking forward to that, and really happy that you all took the time to join us here. And while you can do many things on Zoom, I'm not sure how you do a champagne reception on Zoom, so I think it's better in the flesh. My role tonight is, other than saying this quick welcome, to introduce Professor Siegfried Beer, Chairman of the Board of the Botstiber Institute for American and Austrian Studies. So thank you very much for being here today. Professor Beer is a professor at the Austrian University. He founded the Center for Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies. And I thought to myself, with all the things that are going on in the world these days, I think I should take a couple of lessons at your institute. He's an old hand in the United States. He has been teaching at Columbia, at Harvard University, and at the University of Minnesota. So the United States are really, for you, a home game, I assume. It's great to have you here. I will introduce Professor Beer, and Professor Beer will introduce the next speaker, so I will get out of the way. Thank you all for being here tonight. Looking forward to an interesting lecture. Thank you.
So good evening, and let me welcome you also in the name of the Botstiber Foundation. Botstiber Institute and Botstiber Foundation, a foundation that has become rather important for Austrian-American relations, I believe, although the foundation also has other missions. But the mission that is, of course, important for us today and tonight on our Botstiber Day, once a year we meet to do our business. We have one major goal in this Austrian mission, and that is to promote an understanding of the historic relationship between the US and Austria, including, of course, the lands of the Habsburg Empire, the former Habsburg Empire. We call this institute BIAAS, and it was established in 2008. What do we do? Now for 14 years, we award grants and fellowships and scholarships, mainly for researchers that deal with our topic. We organize events, lectures, and we develop digital programs. We publish a journal, and you probably saw that as you came in. We run a blog series and a podcast series, and we also create videos. So we try to be as modern as one has to be in order to reach an audience in the 21st century. We have so far, I believe, supported more than 150 grantees and fellows, and about 200 projects that they had submitted for financing to us. This happens in the area of history, of politics, law, economics, cultural studies, and more. We also organized for over 10 years now this yearly annual Botstiber lecture, and we're of course very happy that we have a special speaker tonight. And it is my honor to introduce him and say a few words about Dr. Wess Mitchell, who has served quite recently as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia from 2017 to 2019. In other words, he was responsible also for Austria. In this role, he was, of course, paying more attention to NATO and OSCE and Russia and Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean particularly. He also serves as principal and co-founder of the Marathon Initiative, a think tank dedicated to the study of great power competition. And of course, that's an important topic, as we find out again and again. He co-founded that in 2005. He's a fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center, renowned center, and a senior advisor at the US Institute of Peace. His most recent book is The Grand Strategy of the Habsburg Empire, published in 2018 by the Princeton University Press. Let me take this chance to also inform you that our foundation founder, Dietrich W. Botstiber, also wrote a book, his memoirs. And I think it's important that we know as much about him as we can, and this book has made it possible. Dr. Mitchell will talk about the war in the Ukraine and how it affects Austrian-American relations. Thank you.
Very kind of you. Well, thank you, Chairman Beer, for that very warm and generous introduction. I can't get over the novelty of seeing people not on a Zoom screen. And it's just a real joy, actually, to be in a room again after a very, very long pandemic and see real human beings. So let me maybe open with that observation. But thank you, Chairman Beer, and of course, thank you, Kevin McNamara, for having me to talk, and the Botstiber Institute and Foundation, and of course, Ambassador Weiss. What a pleasure to be back at the embassy. Thank you for your Austrian hospitality in having us this evening. I was thrilled when I learned about the existence of the Botstiber Institute from Kevin. He asked me about coming and giving a talk, and when I saw that the mission mentioned the study of the lands of the former Habsburg Empire, I said, you had me at Habsburg, which is, this is a topic in a region that is very close to my heart, a place of some interest and affection for me personally and professionally. Felix, Austria was sort of a first love for me intellectually as earlier in my career, courtesy of writers like Joseph Roth and Stefan Zweig, Frederick Morton. It was always sort of a source of wonder for me that there once was a place, an empire, where the national anthem was sung in 11 languages. And I think that wonder has only grown as I've gotten older and come to see really the burdens of governance that the Habsburgs had on their shoulders through the lens of the modern world. And a lot of those problems are still with us and have only intensified. I assume, looking at it from the perspective of Botstiber Institute, the Austrian contributions in a lot of walks of life are pretty well known: literature, music, science. It's probably less well known that there was an Austrian contribution to American strategic thought. Habsburg immigrants like Robert Strauss-Hupé, Stephen Poseny, Joseph Corbel really had a significant influence on American strategy in the Cold War. It's a project that maybe Botstiber could fund some enterprising young graduate student to write on at some point. But I think this contribution stemmed from the fact that these individuals were refugees from a political civilization that had had long exposure to the pressures of geopolitical frontiers, but had never been coarsened by those pressures. And these individuals had a very profound impact on American thinking about international order from the 1950s onward, and nuclear deterrence. And I think it bears noting that at the start of a talk like this. And of course today it's a relevant topic because we again see the threat of, very, very significant threat of war in our lifetimes, a war that is underway now and could widen. And Central Europe is once again the front line in that struggle. So Kevin asked me to say a few words about the war in Ukraine, where it's heading, how it's unfolding, how it's impacting Europe, and what it means for Austria. So I'll just say, I'll take each of those in turn and say a few words about each of them. The first thing I think we have to acknowledge is that the war in Ukraine is the most significant global event of the last 30 years. The Ukrainians are fighting heroically. They're fighting for their freedom. I think we all have a vested interest in their success, including Austria, certainly the United States. But what makes the war significant is not just the fact of Ukrainian resistance, it's not the fact that there has been such a heartbreaking loss of life, and it's not even what it reveals about the machinations of Vladimir Putin and others in the Kremlin. I think what makes the war significant is that it's a major land war in a modern European country. It's a war for territory and empire at a moment in history when such things were supposed to no longer be possible. I think for many years now there's been a kind of conceit in the Western world that countries, or at least major industrialized countries, no longer go to war with one another. And they certainly don't go to war with one another over old-fashioned things like territory. And I think this is a very deeply embedded conceit that we've been moving towards a sort of post-historical world where countries put commercial prosperity above geopolitics, wars of conquest are no longer possible, companies and profits matter more than countries and borders, and I think that all of those illusions have died in Ukraine. Putin invaded Ukraine for reasons that probably would have been familiar to a Russian czar of the 19th century. He did it for land and access to the sea and empire and influence and prestige. The savagery of the war is equal to anything that we saw in the wars of the 20th century. And the war has the potential, if things go badly, to result in a global conflagration that could kill everyone in this room. So the stakes are massive. And I think it's worth saying that because I sense a growing complacency in the West about the Ukraine war. It's been in the news cycle for a while. I think we all have short attention spans. And in Europe in particular, where I have a lot of friends, I think there's a pervasive mood of wanting to go back to normal. But I think we have to accept the fact that the war is going to be protracted. The fighting and certainly the effects of the war will be with us for a very long time. And I think we have to see that there probably won't be a return to normal, the pre-war normal, for a very long time, economically and otherwise, possibly not in our lifetimes. The situation on the ground has the makings of a protracted conflict. Both Russia and Ukraine possess the capabilities and the will to continue the fight, I think, for quite some time yet. The Russian army appears to have behaved incompetently and lost the flower of its most elite units, probably a good portion of its most advanced munitions, but it still has a lot of fighting power, probably a bottomless supply of artillery shells and rockets to keep pounding Ukrainian cities and killing Ukrainian civilians, inching slowly forward in the eastern territories. The Ukrainians have fought very bravely, and they have a crack force in the field that is supplied with Western munitions, but they do need Western support. They need heavy weapons to hold their ground and resist these attritional attacks that are underway. I think both Putin and Zelensky in different ways certainly have the motivation to continue the conflict. Putin's motivation is the continued existence of his regime, probably his own life. Zelensky's motivation is, of course, to defend Ukrainian liberties and reclaim the Ukrainian homeland. I think for Putin to accept a negotiated settlement, at least at this stage, would probably result in the fall of his regime. I'm speculating, but I think he gambled on a really big scale. And the results of that have not been positive militarily or politically. It's possible that Putin could suddenly be deposed. I hear that speculated about. It's also possible that the two sides will be forced to seek a negotiated settlement out of sheer exhaustion. But even if one of those things happens, I think we have the makings for a frozen conflict. Russian atrocities have created an enmity that will probably last for generations. And even if there were a truce tomorrow, it would probably only be a pause that the Russians would use to rearm and continue the conquest at a later date. And by the way, even if Putin were to escalate dramatically with chemical weapons or, God forbid, low-yield tactical nuclear weapons, I think it's unlikely to break the will of the Ukrainians to resist. And so for all of those reasons, I expect the war to be protracted. The economic effects of the war, I think, are likely to last for quite a while as well. We have to assume that Ukrainian ports will remain offline for months, maybe longer, with all of the attendant effects to Black Sea and Danubian commerce, but also the ripple effects to the world food supply. Ukrainian wheat and other food exports will probably remain disrupted for some time. Russia will continue hoarding its own grain supply well into the summer to prop up the Russian food supply. And Russian energy exports are of course, now highly constricted. The last figures that I saw, Russian crude by vessel has dropped from about 2 million barrels a day to almost zero in the last couple of weeks. So I expect we'll see sustained inflationary pressure and a lot of things that will continue to ripple from this terrible war. None of that is localizable. I think the longer the war goes on, the more likely we are to see monetary contraction at the global level, including the United States. The war has had a galvanizing effect on Europe. If you had told me 6 months ago that we would see some of the decisions coming out of major Western European governments, I would have thought it was impossible in my lifetime. Watching the impact of the war on European security thinking has been one of the most remarkable experiences of my career. I think in the space of a few weeks, Europe basically woke up to the security predicament that it's been in for quite some time. And in that sense, Putin probably did more in a handful of days to get Europe serious about its own defense than many years of US diplomatic effort under successive American administrations. We've now seen a series of actually dramatic policy shifts by European governments. The decision by Finland and Sweden to submit their applications for NATO, the decision by the European Union to reduce reliance on Russian oil and gas, but above all, the historic decision by the Scholz government to fulfill the 2014 NATO Wales Summit pledge to create a $100 billion euro defense fund and to send arms to the Ukrainians and discontinue the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Those are all momentous and, in my view, welcome decisions. I think they collectively deserve their German epithet, the Zeitenwende. Any one of those changes, as I said, I think would have been unthinkable as recently as a few months ago. And if they're fulfilled, I think they have the potential to dramatically transform the European security environment in positive ways for a very long time to come. I think that these changes are rooted in a couple of things. One is fear. I think fear is a very primal motivation that trumps commercial self-interest. And I think when Europeans and all of us in the Western world see precision-grade munitions plowing into high-rise apartment buildings in a major modern European city, I think that's a moment of sobriety for all of us. I think another motivation is a kind of sympathy or solidarity with the Ukrainian people who are under these monstrous attacks. And European publics in particular have been galvanized by the sight of fellow Europeans fleeing their homes and have shown a lot of generosity in response. I guess my concern is that emotions are transient. And the danger that I see is that after sort of an early show of support, that elements of the Western world, certainly in Europe, will fall back into old habits, that they won't follow through on defense plans or will execute those plans half-heartedly. And I think that's a very real possibility, and you see a lot of evidence of this. I think the German government has been under a lot of pressure internally from within the ruling coalition to water down a lot of the defense pledges. The European Union has struggled for weeks now to develop a serious oil embargo because of the resistance of a couple of member states. And I even hear stirrings of resistance in some NATO allies to the idea of permanent troops in Eastern NATO. All of which is to say, I think human beings, I think there is a a shelf life even to something like a war, and I think the tendency will be to default to old ways of doing things. And I would assume, for very obvious reasons, that that tendency will increase the longer the war goes on. I think as Western publics lose interest, or they see the impact on gas prices or reduced social spending, I think we should resist that complacency. It would be a dangerous moment. For starters, I think the immediate impact that it could have on the course of the war itself. The Ukrainians need a continual flow of munitions and money. And so far, the United States has provided more than twice as much aid to Ukraine as all of Europe combined. And bear in mind that Europe has a larger GDP than the United States and is closer to the conflict. I think the bigger danger goes beyond Ukraine itself, and it has to do with stability at a global level. The recent shift of American military resources to Europe is reassuring, I think, to Europeans, because it suggests that America can return to Cold War era levels of presence. And that's not the case. Unlike in the Cold War, the United States has a rising China to think about. It threatens our interests and allies on the other side of the globe. We have to weigh seriously how much resources and attention we should allow ourselves to siphon towards Europe, knowing that China could use our distraction there to make a move on Taiwan. In this landscape that I'm describing, I think Europe simply has to do more for its own security, not as a one-off exercise, but on a standing basis with real capabilities for handling serious threats in a high-intensity operational environment. What that will require, I think, is a determination to stick to new levels of commitment, not just today, but tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And we're seeing that play out now in the politics of a lot of Western European countries. But the key point, the positive point, is that a Europe that stays on the track that it's on now and takes the burden of security seriously will not just be improving its own security, but contributing substantially to stability at a global level. So what does all of this mean for Austria? I think the important point is that Austria, like the rest of Europe, has to take security a lot more seriously than it has in the recent past. To its credit, Austria is considering increasing defense spending. It has consistently backed EU sanctions and energy diversification plans. And Austrian government and civil society have shown a great empathy for Ukrainian refugees and moved swiftly to give them aid and support. And all of that is to be commended. Nevertheless, one cannot escape the impression that Austria has still not fully awakened to the extent of the changes that are underway in its security environment. Efforts to increase defense spending have foundered so far. Percentage-wise, Austrian gas inventories are among the least full of any European nation, at around a fifth of capacity. And there seems to be an unwillingness to even allow a serious debate about the country's security status. I think it's up to Austrians to decide for themselves whether to follow the path of Finland and Sweden and apply for NATO membership. Some Austrians might look at that proposition and sort of balk at it on the grounds that Austria seems less exposed geographically to Russia than either Finland and Sweden. Though I think it's worth noting that the distance from the Austrian border to the Ukrainian border is about 250 miles, which is like the distance from here to West Virginia. There is, of course, a long tradition in post-war Austria of neutrality, and that neutrality has allowed Austria to contribute in its own way, including at some pretty hot moments in the Cold War, to peace and stability. But Austria's neutrality does not mean that it's an island. It's a part of Europe, and it's part of a particularly exposed part of Europe. Austria is part of the political West, and with that comes responsibilities. Austria has a vested interest in seeing Ukraine remain independent and secure. And I would add this point: Austria's neutrality is not immutable. It is contingent on the continued existence of an external environment that allows it to exist as such. That external environment includes the fact of NATO's existence and the presence of American troops in Europe. So whether or not Austria decides to join NATO, I think there has to be a recognition that Austria's current military capabilities are insufficient. Austrian defense spending is the lowest in continental Europe. It's about 0.7% of GDP. And that might have made sense in the 1990s. I think it doesn't make sense today. I think a lot of Austrians increasingly agree with that. A stronger Austrian defense capability adds to the overall strength of Europe, which increases deterrence and makes war less likely. Some might counter that Austria is a small country and that its smallness limits what it can realistically expect to do in the military sphere, and that's true. But Austria is also a very wealthy country. Its GDP is 3 times larger than Ukraine's, for example. I think a good role model for Austria is Switzerland, which is neutral, like Austria, has a similar geography and population, but it spends more than 3 times what Austria currently spends on defense. If Austria does someday elect to apply for NATO membership, it should do so with a view to really contributing. If I had to choose between an Austria that remained neutral but developed real capabilities on the Swiss model, or an Austria that joined NATO but retained an anemic defense capability, I would choose the former. I would choose an Austria that, even if it remains neutral, it has real capabilities and is augmenting European security. Security, of course, is not only about military defense. In recent years, Austria has become a major entrepot for Russian money and influence. Austrian registered subsidiaries of Russian state-owned banks allow Russian money to operate with impunity across Europe. And I think the Ukraine war should be a wake-up call about the dangers of those relationships. I will say, I believe Austria has a leadership role to play in its neighborhood. Its central location makes it a vital component in any realistic plans to diversify energy sources in the Visegrad region. Austria has the unique credibility and reputation, in my view, to encourage stability and conflict resolution in the Western Balkans, where it has made a sizable military contribution over the last 2 decades. Importantly, I think Austria also has the weight and the location to become a champion for a renewed Eastern Partnership program in the European Union, which has really atrophied in recent years and is very much needed in the Western Balkans, and I think it will be needed in a big way in Ukraine in coming years, particularly as the conflict winds down. So I think it's in Austria's interest, Europe's interest, and in American interest for Austria to play a greater role in all of these areas. In my view, the US-Austrian agenda, the bilateral agenda, is ripe for development. One of my last acts before leaving State Department was to launch the US-Austrian Strategic Dialogue that had never existed. It was long overdue that a platform like that exists. I think Ambassador Traina did a lot of good in Austria, improving people-to-people ties. We dramatically increased the number of high-level visits. In some cases, we had the first cabinet level or very senior level visits that had happened in many, many years. So all of that is important, and I think we should sustain that momentum. I think the key in the bilateral relationship is we shouldn't return to the old days of sort of neglect and drift in this relationship. It's a vital relationship. I think there's a lot more to be done in a NATO context. Even if Austria doesn't decide to join NATO, there's a lot that we could do to expand on Austria's partnership activities. And I think that the goal should be to have a tempo of partnership activities that's similar to what NATO had with Finland and Sweden before they decided to join. So in other words, there's plenty to be done in the bilateral relationship at the European level and in NATO. I don't see any lack of ideas for strengthening Austrian security or its relationship with NATO and the United States. The deficit that I see comes not from lack of creativity, but complacency and habit. And as a Habsburg aficionado, I recall how it was often said of Austria in the 19th century that its responsibilities far exceeded its resources. And today, I would say that probably the opposite is true. Austria's resources exceed its responsibilities. I think there's a temptation throughout the West, and I see it a lot in Europe, to want to turn inward and assume that the world will, in a certain sense, sort of take care of itself. I think there's a special Austrian variant to that temptation. And I'm reminded of this line by the great Italian writer Claudio Magris, who wrote a lot about Austria and the Danube, that Austria's wonderful geography created an illusion of seclusion. The way he put it was, it created the illusion of a fortress which offers excellent shelter against the threats of the world and the assaults of life. I think we Americans have a similar illusion because of our encircling oceans, but I suppose my message would be simply that neither Austrians nor Americans can hide from the return of geopolitics. I think we're living through a very turbulent moment in human history. It's also a moment of opportunity. We should view the war in Ukraine as a wake-up call to take greater responsibility early in this century and head off bigger crises down the line. And I think we see from the big decisions that have been made by European governments in the last few weeks that that is possible. And I would say doing more now is our best insurance policy against the return of the old chaos of geopolitics that Europe knew in the past. That requires diligence and the ability to speak frankly to one another in a spirit of friendship and candor. I'm confident that we're going to make the most of this opportunity, and I think the Botstiber Institute and Foundation is doing its part certainly to stimulate those conversations and deepen the understanding and contacts between our countries. So, Chairman Beer, Kevin, thank you, and your colleagues. Thank you to the embassy for allowing me to make these remarks, and I look forward to any questions or conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for your impressive insights about Austria and, of course, America. And we have 15 minutes at least to ask questions, make comments, challenge Dr. Mitchell. Please state your name and also the institution with which you are connected. And we'll start in the first row. Yes?
Thank you. University of Salzburg, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Very persuasive, but cannot agree with
Excuse me, is there a mic coming to you?
Sorry. Reinhard Heinisch, University of Salzburg. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It's very persuasive. I have one question. You seem to juxtapose the role of China and the conflict in Europe. And my question is it not rather the other way around, that the US commitment in the Ukraine would actually forestall potentially Chinese aggression in Eastern Asia? Or isn't the US forced to commit itself even more in Europe in order to showcase its willingness to defend allies, to engage aggressors in order to not run the risk of having to do that in Taiwan? What is your position on that? Thank you.
Well, I think it's an important question, and I would say two things. The first is, I think it's incredibly important for the United States to respond decisively alongside our allies in Ukraine. I think the Chinese watch that closely. I suspect that Vladimir Putin's preferred timeline for acting in Ukraine was probably a little different than Xi Jinping's. The Chinese Army's own published benchmarks that suggest that they would like about 5 more years of modernization before they believe they have a decisive advantage in the Formosa Strait. So I think it can work to our advantage to act decisively, not least to sort of throw off the preferred sequencing of these two states. The second comment I would make, however, is that the issue is that resources are finite. And I can imagine a push-pull factor in the military council that's being offered to Xi Jinping. And perhaps from a Chinese strategic perspective, it could be that by looking at how the United States, for example, is increasing, we're now bringing all of our production lines up to speed to produce the precision-grade munitions that we're supplying to the Ukrainians. Those are the same assembly lines that we use for our own weapons. The Chinese could reasonably conclude from that whatever time advantage that they had is actually a wasting asset. I also think there is a distraction effect. I think it's economic, I think it's political. The Chinese could reasonably conclude that with the Europeans having come along so gamely on sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, that major European countries might balk at sanctions vis-a-vis China in a moment of inflation and recession. So I don't know which way it could ultimately go, but I would say I think diligence is very much indicated. And certainly from a US strategic perspective, I think it's incumbent on us to act and plan with a certain reserve mentality about our commitments to allies in Asia. That requires reserve capacity as part of deterrence.
Thank you. Do I see? Yes, please. It's coming.
you very much. That was a wonderful lecture. My name is Ulrike Wiesner. I'm a native of Austria, and I'm also the president of the American Austrian Cultural Society. That's been somewhat dormant these past 2 years, but we hope to start up our events again. Would you care to say a few words about the role of Turkey in the context of the current applications by Sweden and Finland? I understand that Turkey has put up some resistance, and I'm wondering what their game plan might be in your view.
Well, thank you, ma'am, for that important question. I think the Turks have reasonable security concerns that they believe are not adequately addressed by European states and in NATO. And I think they're using the fact of Finland and Sweden submitting their applications to join NATO to extract as much as they can with regard to their core security concerns, and then throwing in a few other wishes as well. It certainly isn't a moment in the history of NATO when it's in any of our interest to see something as important as Swedish and Finnish entry into the alliance to be complicated by those tactics. I'm confident that we will see movement. I think it benefits the Turks to have the Swedes and Finns in NATO. Some of the demands that Ankara has made in recent weeks relate to genuine security concerns that can probably be addressed. Some of them don't. And I think the job of policymakers in Finland and Sweden and a little bit in Washington is to differentiate between those and do what can be reasonably done to address the real concerns. But I'll be surprised if we don't see a resolution to that, and it probably will be some sort of compromise.
Terry?
Hi, Whitney McNamara. I'm Associate Vice President at Beacon Global Strategies. My question is, I know you said that European nations could lose interest in bulking up against Russia. I know one of the lessons that U.S. analysts are learning, or perhaps overlearning, is that since Russia isn't faring as well as we expected, that perhaps the threat isn't as strong, and therefore we can take a back seat. So I'm curious from a European perspective, what could happen in the what could happen in the next few months that could make Europe say Russia isn't as big of a threat as we thought, so we can take a back seat, ignoring their substantial nuclear arsenal, or what might happen that would, again, reinvigorate Europe to maintain their strong line?
That's a great question. I think a big part of it is, I see domestic drivers that when modern publics see the impact of increased defense spending on other social spending or domestic priorities, I think there's a chilling effect. And some of that sobriety will just come with time. It remains to be seen at what level European publics are really willing to sacrifice financially, larger military establishment, the number of people in uniform, having more German and French troops out on the eastern frontier of NATO. All of that remains to be seen. So I can see some domestic factors that would erode that rhetorical commitment over time. I think everyone's watching events on the battlefield very closely. And I'm wary of a kind of complacency or a mentality that says, well, if we could just get a negotiated settlement along the lines of X, Y, and Z, then we could kind of back off of our security commitments. And I think that is unlikely to bear itself out. And even if the Russian army collapsed in the field tomorrow, and I think it's very unlikely that that would happen, the Russians will remain a serious military force for the foreseeable future. And always keep in mind, they have, as you've mentioned, a very large nuclear arsenal, including a very large number of battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons that we really don't have great answers to, in my view, in Western arsenals or strategies. And so you can imagine a situation where the Russians continue to behave aggressively, but with more devastating weapons or with the threat of those weapons. So I actually think diplomacy is incredibly important in keeping up that momentum. I think it's important that European allies hear from one another as well as from the United States, and certainly from NATO allies who are right at the front line. You ask a Pole or a Latvian what they think about the future of European defense. And so I think it requires diplomacy. I think there is a kind of there's a kind of laziness of mind that sets in. But at the end of the day, it comes down to political leaders in those countries to consistently make the case to their people why this is a priority in public policy that deserves the money and attention. So,
Mr. Cohen, please.
Gary Cohen, University of Minnesota. I'm an historian, and I don't like to predict, but I'm not afraid to ask you. There's a sharp contrast between the willingness of, for instance, Poland and Germany to accept large numbers of desperate Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war. This contrasts sharply with the opposition and resistance to accepting large numbers of refugees earlier from Syria or from Africa or other parts of the Middle East. The Ukrainians, of course, they see as Europeans, as Christians, the others not, but there's much desperation, economic crisis for the refugees from Africa, the Middle East. Are there any tea leaves to be read as yet about either hardening of attitudes in EU members against more refugees from Africa or the Middle East, or any possible changes in their attitude toward those refugees in light of their willingness to accept somebody from Ukraine?
well, Professor Cohen, thank you. It's an important question. The first part of your question, you may have better information than I, but I would politely question the premise of the question, because my understanding is that with respect to Ukrainian refugees from the war, both Poland and Germany in their own ways have shown enormous hospitality. I don't see a great differential. The second part of your question, if I understand it correctly, is then the difference between that hospitality and the reception of North African and Middle Eastern migrants. In the early stages of the migrant crisis in 2014, I'm not sure that was entirely the case. I think it varied by country. But the key distinction that I would make, I think there are obvious cultural similarities of individuals who are coming from contiguous European territories at a similar level of economic development than from North Africa and the Middle East. Also, the fact is a very large percentage of the refugees, certainly in the first couple of waves coming from the Mediterranean region, were large numbers of very young men. The Ukrainian refugee data that I've seen is primarily female and children or elderly people. And then this is the key point to me. They evince a very genuine desire to go back home and help their menfolk who are fighting, or to, so I think perhaps the circumstances of this being really savage war with a lot of loss of life, I think the empathy is in part in response to the magnitude of the war and the atrocities, but also the fact that these are individuals who show a manifest desire to not be permanently relocated. Their homeland is Ukraine. I think there's a deep attachment, and I think the latest data that I've seen bears that out, that a lot of them either are already or intending to go back and help either the economy or the military effort in some way. So that's probably of many reasons, that's probably the biggest I can think of.
Are there any more questions? We have maybe one or two more questions.
Thank you. My
Yes,
name
please.
is Grant Goodall. I'm from Northern Illinois University. My question is, we've seen some tensions over the last several years between different European countries over debt or social issues. And as you said, there's this possible protraction of the European conflict in Ukraine. Do you see those tensions as stalling this further collaboration between European nations and European allies? Or do you see that possibly the need for further defense funding, defense collaboration paving over those flare-ups?
Well, Greg, thank you. It's a great question. I mean, look, so far, the effect seems to be the opposite of disunity. I mean, the war seems to be jolting Europeans to collaborate a lot more closely. You see that institutionally, you see it politically. You see it even between the UK and EU. Now, you don't want to overstate it. I mean, I think there are very real differences of interest, and they're coming to the surface in the EU debates about oil embargo or defense spending in NATO and a variety of things. But I think on balance, the war has tended to increase the cohesion. The big question in my mind is how long does that last? Because I think the natural tendency of people, and certainly people in the West and democracies, is short of attention span, we move on. And I think that's where political leadership and statecraft comes in internally as well as with one another. On your right.
One more?
On.
Yes, please. Last row, thank you.
There's a lady on your right.
What are your feelings regarding the current world food crisis that's building and what can be done to counter it? They've asked, Russia to permit shipments of grain from the Ukraine to flow, and yet nothing's been done so far. Is there any way the heat can be put on them from all the nations that are suffering or will soon suffer?
Well, it's a gigantic question. In some ways, it's the biggest question for us to think through in terms of the next phase of the war, because the impact is already dramatic. It's probably about to get a lot more dramatic. The starvation in parts of the world, but even here in the United States, the effect on fertilizer prices or the gas prices. And the short answer to your question is I think that we should anticipate a situation where Putin uses a consolidation of his military gains in the East and South to sort of say, okay, I'm declaring victory because I've retaken Novorossiya, and then in a way to shift the moral onus to the West. Say, by continuing to support the Ukrainians, you're allowing a war to go on that's causing people to starve. That allows Russia to galvanize the global South, which has been very neutral and non-committal throughout this, sort of as a moral factor of pressure on the West. And I think the best answer to that is to help the Ukrainians all that we can. I'm leery of any of the, I think, very cynical offers that the Russians have made for grain corridors, or I would focus on the Turkish Straits. I think the Turkish government's, in my view, somewhat selective implementation of the Montreux Convention creates a situation where if NATO needed to get ships into the Black Sea to escort commercial vessels carrying food supplies, we wouldn't be able to. And so I think it starts in some ways with some conversations about Turkey, with Turkey. Beyond that, I other than a resolution to the conflict itself, I don't see anything on the ground, unless I'm missing something, that would allow Ukrainian, I think there's something like 20 million tons or some incredible amount of grain alone that's sitting in Ukrainian warehouses. I don't see any scenario where we get that out in a war zone. I just don't think commercial companies can even get insurance to get the ships into the places with sea mines and with, and I think the Russians will continue to hoard their own, both for reasons of domestic consumption and political pressure. But it's a gigantic issue.
I would like to bring Austria back at the very end. I liked your insights into the neutrality issue. This was a neutrality that was supposed to be immerwährend, was the German word. I'm not even sure it was in the dictionary before 1955. But immerwährend means eternal. But the more important reference actually is to Switzerland, on the model of Switzerland. And we did not pay attention to that for a long time. And I think this might be the moment to remember that this neutrality was on the model of Switzerland. So whatever you said and all you said about neutrality, if that's the position of the American government, I like it.
I can't speak for the American government.
Okay. Well, thank you,
you.
Dr. Mitchell, for your presentation and your ideas and your thoughts, and thank you for participating.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.